psychedelics, and it's nice to see it being more normalized, but also it can place a lot of hope for people who are suffering from things like depression or PTSD, for example, that this might be the answer and the solution. And it can be a bit of a problem when it might not happen straight away. So you could have, like, you know, mushrooms or ayahuasca and expect these big profound changes to happen straight away. And for some people it can, but that's definitely not always the case. And I think it's really good that we keep those expectations around what psychedelics will do for us a little bit in balance and a little bit in check. And also understand that it's not necessarily always just a really quick, straightforward process. So I'm wondering what you'd like to add to that, Simon?
I think the only thing I'd add to that is that if you're someone who's dealing with some really, really difficult issues, or you've got like a really big trauma background, there are bigger risks to taking psychedelics in terms of the opportunity for there to be really difficult experiences that might lead to persistent, you know, trauma that can lead to PTSD. And actually, if you bring up a whole bunch of difficult things from the past and don't have a framework and a container to actually process all of that afterwards, that can do more harm than good. So I think there's a bit of a problem with the media portraying these things as a quick fix, that a lot of people get that impression out of it, and I think there's some issues with that.
Thanks, Simon. So we're going to go a bit into preparation now, and this will be, I guess, a little bit media, but what do you recommend for anyone who's planning to take psychedelics? Why do people use psychedelics? Can you talk about what set and setting means? And if there are any contraindications or medical conditions that might need a bit more caution? Basically ways to create safety and comfort, or ways to manage difficult experiences.
I think this is why a lot of people come to make contact with organisations like the Australian Psychedelic Society and EGA and Patch, is to try and answer these questions. If you're new to psychedelics as a concept, or you haven't been exposed to them very much before, that it's a good idea to reach out to the existing community, because there's a lot of community knowledge that's been built up over decades that's readily available when you find the right people to talk to about it. There's also a lot of resources online that'll help sort of explain what to expect, because even though there's like these popular media portrayals of what a psychedelic experience is like, a lot of them aren't really that realistic, you know, and a lot of them don't actually paint a very true picture of what those experiences are like, and a lot of them probably don't look at some of the particular risks for specific individuals as well. So when I think about like giving advice to people on how to be best prepared for a psychedelic experience, I like to sort of think about what I call a who, what, where, when and how type model. The who is basically who should and shouldn't really be taking these substances in the first place. I think if you have a psychotic spectrum illness, like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, the risk is higher. I have seen people develop psychosis after use of psychedelics, and that probably is in people who already had a very vulnerable brain, because that's not borne out in studies of well-selected healthy individuals who don't have a family history or a personal history of that. But it is a risk and it is a possibility. The other aspect of the who is who should you take them with, and maybe who you shouldn't take them with. A lot of stuff can come up while you're under the influence, and you need to feel safe in that experience. You also need to be safe in that experience. Psychedelics can leave you relatively incapacitated, and if you're around people who might prey on you during that instance, that's a really high-risk situation that you might not be able to get yourself out of in the moment. When that happens while you're under the influence, that is extremely traumatic, and it does happen. And it happens in facilitated groups, and it happens in friendship groups, and it happens at parties and doofs and raves, and it's something to actually be really aware of and mindful of, that you need to be feeling safe and you need to actually be safe in terms of who you're around. The what is, what are you actually taking? And that's super important, and it's getting sort of harder and harder to find out since the introduction of the novel psychoactive substances, of which there are now thousands and thousands that get manufactured largely overseas and sent over here and sold as stuff that they're not. You know, we see all sorts of weird stuff popping up in MDMA capsules, and even on paper tabs there's been stuff that isn't LSD. Cocaine and things like that now, ketamine, are being adulterated with really potent opioids. Benzodiazepine tablets that you buy on the street are often actually adulterated with really potent opioids as well, if they're not real pressed pharmaceutical products. So the what of what you're taking is really important. There are ways that you can test drugs yourself using reagent kits, and thankfully and finally Queensland is now having fixed site pill testing and drug testing and mobile drug testing at festivals, which is just a phenomenal breakthrough. That's an excellent health promotion harm reduction intervention. Canberra obviously also have a fixed site, and there have been some trials in New South Wales. So knowing what you're taking, can you trust who you bought it from? Are they very clear on what it is? And for some of the natural products like mushrooms, it's really important to know the species as well, because the psilocybin content between species varies massively. Like the cold weather wood-loving species that tend to grow further south, but also inland up this part of the world, they are sometimes nearly twice as strong as the cubensis that grow in like cow dung in the warm weather. So you can't dose equivalent, then you might actually end up taking double what you thought you were, unless you know what species the mushroom was. There's also a few strains of cubensis that do tend to be a lot stronger than others, like penis envy, and all the lineage that came from the penis envy strain. So if someone's selling you cultivated cubensis, it's good to ask what strain it was. There's only a few that are likely to be stronger than the rest. And anybody who tells you the rest are particularly different is probably a bit of a marketing pitch, but penis envy and the rest are quite a lot stronger than most of the other cubes. So know what you're taking, and then know what the dose is, and that information is available online. So if you know what substance is, you need to then check what a safe dose of that substance is actually going to be. If you're taking a pill or a capsule, a capsule, at least you can tip it out and weigh what is in it so that you know what the dose is and put it back in the capsule, or the guy selling it to you should be able to tell you how much is actually in there. Pills, they vary heaps in potency. So it is still the best approach, particularly now that there might be other weird stuff in there that could be really dangerous. Start low and go slow. You should not be taking 3 pills at a time and then hoping for the best, because once it's in your body, really hard to get back out. You can always add more later. The where you should be taking it's pretty self-explanatory, right? Like you need to actually be in a safe location. And when I give this advice, it's often, you don't want to go into these situations expecting the worst to happen, right? Because that sets you up to have a bad experience as well. But you do want to know that there are some backup plans and that you've actually thought this stuff through pretty well. So going out in the middle of the bush where you've got no phone reception and everyone you're with is going to be completely off chops and no one's going to be able to safely drive or reach out for help. Dangerous situation. Lots of people do it, sure, but it's probably not the safest way to go about things. So have a think about where you actually are. Again, where you are, what responsibilities you have where you are. If you're the only person caring for your child at home, probably not a great idea to go balls deep with a psychedelic experience. So you need to be, you've got to go to work early the next morning and you're taking some mushrooms at 9 o'clock at night. Probably not a great idea. So where you are and what your responsibilities in that place are, think about them in advance and think about how you will call for help if you need to. And who's going to provide first aid if they need to. Have someone sober, or at least sober enough to do that sort of stuff there with you. And if your escape or your emergency plan is to drive somewhere, make sure someone can actually drive safely. Because it's not going to do you any favours if everybody hops in the car to go and get phone reception to call an ambulance and end up crashing into a tree and killing a lot of you. It's just, it's common sense sort of stuff. The when is thinking about your life circumstances. A lot of people use psychedelics to try and deal with trauma and deal with difficult times, but is it the best time to do that immediately after the trauma has happened? Because again, this can leave you in a pretty vulnerable state. It can bring up things that you may not be able to pack down again afterwards. So have a thought about, when is actually the best time to be approaching it, particularly if you are trying to do that sort of self-development or mental health improvement type work. If you're taking them because you just want to have a good time and stuff, and that's your framework and your set, then okay, maybe there's a little bit less worry about that, but you need to be aware of what your individual circumstances in that moment are. And how you're going to take them, that's just how you're going to take them. You're probably going to take them orally most of the time with the psychedelics, but bear in mind that if you're smoking some of the smokable psychedelics, they'll come on really, really quickly. DMT, Changa, 5-MeO, all that sort of stuff will come on fast. Make sure you're sitting down, make sure that you're not standing up, make sure that you're not in a river. So have a thought about some of those things as well, because the way you take them does actually change things. If you are going to inject a substance, then do all of the necessary safety stuff for injecting. Injecting psychedelics isn't that common, but some people do it. And there was an awful case in America not that long ago where somebody injected a bunch of mushroom tea and ended up with sepsis and fungal sepsis because they had injected a natural product, and that's a really bad idea. So don't do that. But also, if you are going to use some of those other modalities of ingestion of a substance, be mindful of what the risks of those are.
Cool, thank you, Simon. I'd also encourage you to learn about and look up the specifics around whatever it is that you're planning to take, because not all psychedelics do carry the same risks, particularly when it comes to physical health risks. There are definitely some psychedelics like iboga. Ibogaine is the main alkaloid that's extracted out of it, but if you're having iboga root bark, it does contain many different alkaloids, and it is particularly known to be able to affect the heart. So that's just one example, and it is probably one of the most risky out of the more classical psychedelics. So that's not including those new designer chems, which the phenylethylamines are definitely also problematic. And so again, if you're taking stuff that you think is one thing, but it's actually another, and that's where these designer chems can actually be sold as LSD and other things like that, you can absolutely run into serious medical problems. Otherwise, while they may, generally speaking, be relatively psychologically safe, it's not for everyone. Some people do have those underlying conditions, or are more prone to things like delusional thinking or anxiety. So there are definitely those sorts of things to consider as well. Toad medicine or toad excretions are usually smoked. That's another one that also has to be used with a great deal of caution. So both iboga and toad have had deaths associated with them. So while it might not be that frequent, it is a very serious thing that you understand for your own circumstances. Is this something that's particularly going to be a risk factor for you? And also, why are you taking it? Like, if you're taking iboga or ibogaine to detox from opioid addiction, they are often taking quite high doses, and this is in people who are often already health compromised. So that is another reason we're likely to have seen some deaths associated with it. And also when it comes to mixing things, so if you take a shot of heroin not very long after you've had iboga, another big problem. And false memories actually seem to have come up with iboga a few times anecdotally from what I've seen. So it's just to give you a bit of an idea of the things that you can encounter, of which it's quite vast. But I do strongly recommend that if you're going to work with a psychedelic, that you learn a lot about that particular psychedelic and see how it relates to your circumstances before you engage with it.
Yeah, and in terms of like contraindications, and like contraindication is a medical term for when there's a risk associated with taking something because of your individual health status. There are risks of medication interactions with some psychedelics, and I won't go into like all the details of that. EGA have a great combination matrix in terms of the combinations of different plants that are and aren't safe. The one thing that I would definitely flag is that ayahuasca and changa contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors. If you take something with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor in it on SSRIs or most of the other antidepressants and a range of other medications, the risk that you develop serotonin syndrome is extremely high, and that's an immediately life-threatening situation. So if you are on other medications or you're planning to combine different substances, do the research, do the reading. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of resources. There's also a lot of people that are happy to answer these questions in the community. Who have knowledge and have professional backgrounds that let them answer those questions with some accuracy. So make sure that you check before combining stuff with medications. Also, if you've got a really complex physical health condition, make sure that you ideally run it by your doctor. You might be surprised at how accepting some of them would be to have that conversation. And if they're not, find someone who is, or at least talk to someone in the community who has a background that's able to help you make those decisions so that you can stay safe.
Yeah, I've actually had some of those awkward conversations before with medical people, but it can go better than you think. And also, if you are someone who does have more complex health problems, do factor that in when you're planning. Like, if you've done all your research and you're still committed to doing it, I always have a good backpack loaded with stuff when I go traveling anyway, but especially if I'm going to engage in anything psychedelic, or when I went overseas to Peru, I took my own first aid kit and I had everything sorted, so I was not relying on somebody else in case things went wrong. And thankfully, I had a friend who was there, who's also with us today, so it helped me to access the things that I couldn't even reach in my first aid kit, and is why I made it back out of the jungle. So, yeah. Anyway, moving on. Thanks, though.
Yeah. So tripping with friends and partners can be deeply bonding experiences with intimate conversations. What should people keep in mind when engaging in these experiences with others, including sex under the influence?
Yeah, this is a really big one, and we could talk to this one all day, so we're really just going to touch on it, and in particular it is incredibly complex, and it's amazing the things you don't even think about that can come up while you're tripping. But the first thing I would probably say is don't make big life decisions when you're under the influence or even shortly thereafter. Yeah, I mean, like, it might seem like a great idea that you want to, end your marriage and hook up with your best friend or something like that, or fuck my boss, I'm quitting. And that might even still be for a few days afterwards in the afterglow. So maybe leave it a good at least week, but up to a month. I would be looking at maybe a month before I considered acting on the things that I felt like as a big life decision that might have come up while I was tripping. And when it comes to friends and co-workers, especially like if you're closer with your co-workers and you're tripping with them, you can disclose things that you might not have said if you weren't under the influence, and that can have big impacts on your life there afterwards. Definitely can end up over bonding with friends and ending up in situations where you're like, shit, I probably wouldn't have done this if I wasn't under the influence. So think about who you're doing it with, what might come up and how you might navigate that, and if it's a good idea to then be doing it with those people. But it can also be very bonding and healing in very good ways. It can bring families together. I actually think when we look at psilocybin has been very useful for end of life anxiety, and that's great, but we also have all of the people who are around them, their families, so it might be their children, or parents or siblings. They're also going through that experience. It's not just the person who's dying, and in fact, after the person has actually passed away, it's everybody else who is left to process that. And this is where it does offer potential to be able to help with some of those processes and bond families and through these tough times. But again, it's not a simple thing. It's not just innately going to work that way for everyone. But would you like to add to that, Simon?
Yeah, I think they are ego boundary shifting substances, so that notion of where you end and where others start kind of blurs, and that's part of the healing potential, but it can also lead to you forming attachment extremely rapidly with somebody else, and sometimes with people you might find later that actually you're not that compatible with and maybe don't want to be that attached to. So along with making massive life decisions, just be mindful that there is an aspect of artificiality to the emotional experiences and the attachment experiences that happen while you're under the influence of psychedelics, and try and bear that in mind moving forward, and as much as you can actually try and bear that in mind in the moment as well. And I think that leads on to the idea of sex and consent while under the influence as well. I'm not saying people can't and shouldn't have sex under the influence of psychedelics, and obviously a lot of partners do and a lot of strangers do, but it does change the dynamic of informed consent and capacity to give informed consent pretty dramatically. And we should all at this stage know that consent needs to be given actively at the time, and it needs to be continued, and that it can be withdrawn at any time, at any stage throughout an intimate experience. I think there is more onus when engaging in intimate acts while under the influence to be mindful of the fact that they actually need to be conscious and sort of aware enough to withdraw that consent. And if you feel like that's shifted and the person that you're engaging in that act with isn't actually with it enough to do that anymore, assume the consent is gone and stop immediately, because the trauma that can happen later if you don't is dramatic. The breach of trust and the sense of lacking safety and injury that actually causes is huge. And I think unfortunately this happens in facilitated groups as well, that there can be sort of predatory behaviours. It happens in friendship groups, like I said before. So again, it's about being mindful of who you're safe with too. And I think if you are taking it with someone and thinking that intimate sort of activities might be on the cards, discuss that before as well, but don't assume that consent before the ingestion is going to be there the whole way through. So you still need to recheck in, and you need to have like a frank and open discussion saying, look, if I midway through this ask you if you want to start doing something intimate, you can say no, and it's okay to say no, and I'm not going to take offense to that, because we might be in two very different places. And this even within like intimate partnerships, like even within relationships, where, you know, there might be this assumption that they're going to be on the same level and you're feeling, you know, like you want to get down with it, and they're feeling like they want to get down with it. That assumption doesn't hold, right? Like you while you're in the midst of that experience, can be in a very different space of mind, and they might be dealing with something really difficult inside their head while you're feeling horny. You don't want to then sort of just assume that because you're in a relationship there is that consent there, or assume that because you talked about it before you got high that consent is still there as well. So you need to check in as you go, and you need to keep checking in as you go, and you need to make sure that the person you're with has actually got capacity to give that consent as you move forward as well.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that, it is really good to consider that you should talk about this before you get altered if you are planning to engage in sexual activity with someone, because no one really wants to deal with either side of this, where they were intoxicated and they engaged in a sexual act and then regret it, or you're the person who's engaged in a sexual act and you're looking at someone who's going like, I really wish I didn't do that with you. No one wants to feel that way. And it's much more safer, you're much more likely to have gotten an honest response if you've talked about that before you've gotten very altered. And, you know, like, I get the excitement and getting caught up in the moment and all of that, but, you know, you can still hook up after you're not under the influence, or even get under the influence with them again later. So it can really be good to just have that bit of patience and approach things mindfully, so it's just less likely that anyone's going to have a bad experience.
Okay, group ceremonies, which in this part of the world happen quite a lot. Could you describe a bit about etiquette, questions to ask, and red flags with facilitators?
Yeah, we definitely, I think, are in the ayahuasca drinking capital of Australia. And so we do have a lot more group stuff that happens here, but, you know, it's certainly not just the Northern Rivers. Melbourne's also fairly known for it, and like APS has chapters all over Australia for good reason. So there definitely are a lot more group ceremonies popping up. And when you go to one, it can be really nervous, not knowing what to expect. So the best thing to do is to have a sense of what to expect, to ask questions, to know who is giving you the medicine. The first time I ever went to a group ceremony, I didn't know the facilitator's name. I didn't expect there was going to be 60 odd people in a teepee, and that was very overwhelming. Like, I was okay, but it wasn't very practical for them to keep track of 60 people, even with a lot of assistance. So yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind. Ask questions before you go. Know who is giving you this psychedelic, what is their experience, what is their background. Ask some of those questions, and if you're not able to get answers out of them, then consider, is this still something you want to proceed with? Like, why are they not able to answer basic questions? Do they have a plan in case something goes wrong? What will happen if you suddenly develop a medical emergency? Are they prepared to call an ambulance? You might just think, of course someone would. But unfortunately, that's not the case. I've had too many people report to us that they'd asked for an ambulance to be called or run into serious medical problems, and sometimes they weren't. But, you know, it's really something to consider. If you're the one who is facing something you think is a very serious emergency, are you sure that that is going to happen? Or, like, one person even had their phone taken away from them by a facilitator. Like, it's not something you should just innately presume. And I would have that. If someone was running into trouble, they're going to call an ambulance. But don't. Have a plan. Let someone know where you're going. Tell them what time to expect you back. So at least that way, if you don't, there's someone that's going to check in and find out why, what's happened with you.
Yeah, and I think some other really important questions there are, how many sort of facilitators and assistants to participants are there going to be? What's the ratio? Are all the people facilitating the ceremony also going to be ingesting substances, or will a few people there at least be sober? Do they have first aid training? I also think if anyone pushes back on those sort of fundamental safety questions, that to me is just an immediate no. You know, I think anybody who has issues answering some simple questions about how they're going to keep you safe during those experiences, you got to wonder why. And you know, I think that is just one of those big red flags. You know, having off ratios and having no one sober there and having no one with first aid training and not being agreeable to calling an ambulance are all just big red flags. I think there's also a big variety in like facilitator styles in terms of the way they pitch the experience and the way they're going to try and interpret the experience with you and for you. Some of those match people better than others. You know, you hear a lot about cultural ideas that come from other cultures that really aren't that applicable to most of our cultural backgrounds being brought in and then being sort of pushed and expecting that you will just adopt that. So the idea that all of the problems in your life are because you've been attached by some entity that, you know, to me, what do you then do about that? You know, I've got this evil spirit attached to me. And the idea there is that the facilitator is somehow going to get rid of that for you. My perspective is that you should be coming out of these experiences with a greater sense that you can actually handle your own problems, because that empowers you to deal with the stresses that are going to pop up later in life. Whereas if you've come out of it getting the message that every time something bad pops up and I'm not coping, I see somebody else, they give me some psychedelics, they'll heal me and then I'll be okay. Well, what's your response the next time something goes wrong? You just got to go through that same loop. You're not getting that self-efficacy, that self-resilience and that capacity to actually manage your own issues. But that's not to say that if that is the approach that gels with you, then fine. But still make sure that all the other red flags aren't present as well. And ask them a little bit about what their approach is and how they interpret these experiences as well before you go and engage somebody to help facilitate a session.
Yeah, and also look out for your friends. Like if you're going to a ceremony with a friend or with a group of friends, keep an eye out for each other. Make sure that they're okay. Check in. And don't just go with hierarchy or like, you know, the shaman, the facilitator knows everything and their judgment is to never be questioned. If you feel really unsafe or you feel like something's off or somebody needs an ambulance or you do, don't let them bully you into not going with that or like, no, this person is the authority figure. You always have the ability to decide that and keep your autonomy.
Another red flag for me is any facilitator that tries to hit on you before, during or after the experience. I view that as problematic. There are reasons that teachers can't date students even if they're adult students. There are reasons that medical practitioners can't date, you know, or have intimate contact with patients, clients or their family members. There's an inherent power imbalance that exists in opening yourself up in a vulnerable way to someone who is inherently in a position of authority over you to some extent. And I don't actually view that as vastly different to a facilitator-client relationship in one of these sorts of sessions. I know some people see that very differently. I know some facilitators see that very differently. Not all, but some. So I think just be mindful that there is a power imbalance there. There is that possibility for forming rapid attachment. There is a possibility for, you know, holding facilitators in really high regard, and that's fine. But you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that if they do hit on you, it should be seen as like a, oh yeah, I'm let into the club type deal. And I think the other thing is any facilitator that tries to blame a bad outcome on you, and this unfortunately I think does happen a little bit. We certainly hear about it. I mean, I think we hear more about the bad experiences than we do the positive ones, so it's a bit of a biased sample. But sometimes people have a really difficult experience in a facilitated ceremony, and the facilitator's response to that isn't to try and find out what's going to help them process that experience. It's to say, I did my job well, this is all your bad energy, or you didn't do the right work beforehand, or you came into this with too much resistance, so your problem to deal with now. And that's not helpful, and it's also not your fault, you know. So I think generally speaking, asking facilitators about how they're going to actually support you after the ceremony is a really good thing to know as well. And just bear in mind that if you're ever in that situation, it's okay to raise concerns and it's okay to go and seek help elsewhere. It is never your fault that you've had a bad experience, it just is what it is. And some of it might actually be their fault for the way they've set out the whole thing to begin with. But there are still ways to go and process that later. If someone tells you that you're just fundamentally flawed, well, that's useless information, go and find someone that's going to be more helpful. And oftentimes I would then say, go and seek integration support from a psychologist. A lot of psychologists in Australia now are doing integration work, even if they don't facilitate the dosing session. So I think you can actually still merge these two approaches and have the experience facilitated, or on your own, or however you choose to do it. But if you're actually trying to do some really deep work and process some really difficult emotional experiences, seeking some professional support with a counsellor that you get along with well is still, I think, a really sensible thing to do, and I think a really helpful thing to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think too, we should also keep in mind when it comes to guruism that we all play a role in that as well. Some of the facilitators are kind of a little bit like rock stars. I've definitely encountered one myself who seemed to think he was a bit of a rock star, and the community also helped feed that. You can't have a guru if you do not have the people around them to elevate them as a guru. So we do have to take some personal responsibility there as well, and think about, are we over-inflating this person's ego? It is one thing to be appreciative, but something I've definitely seen and participated in myself is excessive reverence, where we're mind blown by this big experience that we've just had, and so we obviously, very excitable, and we want to give them lots of praise. And I think over years this can affect anyone's state of mind. But it definitely, some people are already more prone to it, and it doesn't go well. This is why we're seeing so many documentaries on cults. So it's not something specific to psychedelics, but when you look at actually how these things work within the brain, the elevation of oxytocin gives you this sense of an instant community, instant attachment to all the people around you. And that definitely changes your perception of those people around you. So it's just something that's really good to keep in mind, and just keep that, appreciation with a bit of balance. So, Simon, could you please give us some tips for caring for yourself after psychedelics, including integration and where to get support?
I think this is like a really individual dependent thing, and it does depend a little bit on what your background is and what you're actually trying to get out of the psychedelic experience, and that intention does determine a lot of what you might actually need thereafter. Because again, if you're doing some really deep emotional work or trying to process some really difficult trauma, it's likely that you're going to need more support afterwards than if you're otherwise in a pretty good headspace and you're having them to do a bit of self-exploration or have some fun. Something even in those sort of intention settings might pop up that you weren't expecting, that then needs to be dealt with thereafter. But I think you can expect that if you're trying to do really deep work, you're going to need more support after the experience than you might otherwise. There's a range of ways that you can approach it, and again, I think to some extent it depends a lot on what you're actually trying to deal with and what your baseline level of sort of psychological state is. For people who are dealing with really, really difficult stuff, personally I think professional support is important. And again, that can be not necessarily someone who's actually facilitating the experience, but can provide some preparation work beforehand and some integration work afterwards, through whatever sort of therapeutic modality gels with you and they're familiar with. If you're not sort of in that level of need, you can do peer-led support. So there's peer-led integration circles that, like, the Australian Psychedelic Society run in a few places. We'll be looking to run some online. And there's, I think, other people that run those sorts of circles, or maybe you've just got a little community yourself that you know well, that you can sit down with and actually talk about the experiences and learn from each other's interpretations of those experiences, and get some more meaning out of that. The basic idea behind integration is like meaning making. You need to make sense of what is sometimes a pretty ineffable but profound experience, and it might not be really clear at the time why it felt so profound, so you need to do a bit of exploration of that. And you can do that later through a whole bunch of different techniques, but actually it's a pretty conscious process. You need to sort of put some active effort into it, which again comes back to the insights you have in the moment during the experience need to be thought on afterwards, because they might seem really profound and meaningful at the time, and later when you think about it, you might go, oh, maybe that wasn't as significant as I thought it was. I think the other important thing is that not everything that happens under the influence of a psychedelic should be incorporated into your day-to-day life thereafter. Some of these like profound sort of experiences you can have actually thereafter might just be attributed to the drugs were making my brain do some weird shit. And you know, we've sort of heard reports of people who, like, you know, they're taking these with their partner and suddenly they see their partner as a demon, and thereafter they assume that must mean that their partner is in fact evil and trying to get them, and it terminates relationships. And I think actually is a risk of then like domestic violence, and, you know, actually if you think that person's a threat to you, to actually instigate harm against them later. So you can actually come back to that and sit on that later. If you're trying to make the whole experience meaningful and relatable to your day-to-day existence, I think that's not the best approach. Some of it will be, once you've interpreted a little bit. Some of it is probably best just put down to the fact that these are really powerful substances that really change our perception and our experience of ourselves and other people. So that's basically like the principles of integration, and then how you do that really depends on your level of need. Some people need that higher level clinical support, some people just peer-led support, and some people can actually just do this process consciously on their own, and that might involve journaling and just active reflection and thinking about it and relating those insights to your day-to-day existence. Because oftentimes you'll have these experiences where you realise there are some aspects of your behaviour that you're maybe not so fond of, there are some aspects of your interactions with others that maybe you're not so fond of. You need to find out how to take those insights and actually make them applicable moving forward. And I think people often sort of chase these realizations a lot. You know, that you'll have that psychedelic experience, you'll have that sense for the days and maybe a couple of weeks afterwards that you've really come to some profound realizations, but you notice that things aren't actually changing in your day-to-day life. So you go and you have another psychedelic experience, and you have these profound realizations, and then that lasts for a couple of weeks and then it goes away. Psychedelics in your brain allow your brain to form new connections and new pathways much more easily than it does usually. And that's probably why they're so helpful for changing patterns of thought and behaviour. But that plasticity needs to be directed. And if you're not putting active effort into directing that, the connections and then the pathways that are underlying your default patterns of thinking and behaviour, they just stay the way they were anyway. You need to direct that biological change, and you can do that through behavioural strategies and psychological strategies, but you need to do it sort of fairly consciously.
It's always a good idea to have a bit of sleep before you go back to work, have a bit of a break between psychedelic sessions, eat and sleep and drink water. It sounds very basic, but our bodies really need those, and it definitely helps you to have a better experience, for sure. If you're going in very sleep deprived, or you're coming out of it sleep deprived and you're rushing off to work, it's very hard to integrate. You also could be saying all kinds of things at work about, you know, because you're very excited, you're in the afterglow, or when you're going back home, re-entering family life, whatever it is, just have a plan about how you're going to do that, and don't just expect that you can hit the ground running and rush out the door to do whatever. It's always good to take that time to rest and recover. So we're pretty much towards the end of the main juicy stuff. Yeah, boundaries and I guess the ethics of what facilitators or in clinical practice, what is okay and acceptable behavior and what is not, and why is trauma-informed practices coming up a lot? Why are they important?
Very brief overview of a very, very complex question. Trauma-informed practices basically just mean bearing in mind that somebody's individual history influences how, when and where they will feel safe, and trying to tailor a context and a setting to ensure that that individual actually feels safe in that space. And what that looks like for everyone differs, because everyone's got a different history, different background and different trauma experiences in the past. So it's an individual thing, but it's something you might be able to identify a lot for yourself, just thinking about where you do feel safe, where you do feel comfortable. And that's sort of the fundamental of trauma-informed approach. And also being mindful that these traumatic experiences in the past can come up quite often during psychedelic experiences, even if that wasn't your intention. And then you've just got to sort of deal with it thereafter. But if you have a lot of trauma in the background, it is more likely to come up during that moment. You are going to need to do something to package that again and make sense of it afterwards. Otherwise, you're just left with more unresolved trauma. It's just re-traumatizing without resolution, and that's less helpful, more harmful. boundaries in clinical practice are pretty well defined. We have clear professional guidelines around what is and is not acceptable. That does not mean that clinicians do not breach those boundaries. It does happen, unfortunately, and you still need to look out for your own safety and be aware of what is and isn't acceptable professional practice, to say no if people are trying to do something you know isn't okay, or doing something that's making you feel unsafe. And I think that's the same with, you know, underground facilitators or within peer groups. Again, I've talked about, to me, boundaries like relationships with people you're treating or facilitating for are just off the cards. Relationships with their family members for clinical practitioners are off the cards. Again, that a lot of facilitators, I think, not a lot, some see that differently. So just being mindful that those things do vary in people's mind, and what you think is a very clear and obvious boundary, somebody else may not. So it's good to tell people what your boundaries are as well, and you should be asked that as well before going into any of these experiences. If you're not, again, that's a red flag, and you need to sort of make your boundaries known. One thing to touch on there is something called like therapeutic touch that is used sometimes in clinical practice, and it's not intimate touch, but it is physical contact. And again, some people are more comfortable with that than others, and even if you're comfortable with that in a sober state, you may not be comfortable with that in a psychedelic state. And even if you were comfortable with that the last time you took psychedelics, you might not be the next time. So again, it's just a matter of that informed consent process every time touch is actually going to be used, because touch can make people feel really unsafe, particularly if they have a trauma history. So boundaries, know what you want your boundaries to be, and make sure other people who are taking psychedelics or around you when you're taking psychedelics are aware of what your boundaries are.
Yeah, it can be really good to talk about that too before you enter a psychedelic experience with a facilitator or someone where that might happen, like what you are and are not okay with, and make sure that you're both on the same page. Yeah, and we unfortunately have had, it wasn't someone who was conducting psychedelic assisted therapy with the patient per se, but one of the more influential people in this space had recently been in trouble for misconduct for dating one of his former patients. So it can and does happen generally within, you know, counseling, psychiatry, psychology, teaching, all of these fields will have this happen sometimes. But there's just that added layer of risk, I guess, when you're considering psychedelics in the mix as well. So we just need to be very, I guess, mindful, careful, looking out for each other, and actually calling those things out if they happen, especially if it's in a clinical setting. You've got bodies to report this to. We have AFRA in Australia, is the main regulatory body for medicine. But yeah, it's definitely not something that you should just let fly under the radar. And it's the same thing in the underground space as well. Unfortunately, too much of this has been suppressed and kept quiet. People don't feel safe to speak up, and often with that guruism as well. You can be shunned and isolated from your community if you do say something about it. So it's really important that we are all aware of those boundaries, why they're important. And in that particular case that had come up recently, the former patient has since died. It can have real and serious consequences. So yeah, that pretty much brings us to the end, even though it's not the brightest note to end on. As we said, we do get a lot of the negative feedback. We're not at all being negative towards psychedelics. We think that they're wonderful. It's just that, you know, how we approach them makes the difference between whether or not they're going to be beneficial or harmful. It's not really the psychedelic alone per se, but it's how we use them. It's the dosage, it's the people around you. Okay, so thanks everyone. Now I'd like to see if any of you have questions.
Sorry, there's a big bud coming through.
Sorry for disturbing everyone.
No, we love it.
Hi, naked bud.
Mine's more a comment than a question, and that is, anybody who's under any influence of any drug can make a statement of no complaint to the police where they don't actually investigate it. So if you do feel like there's someone harmful out in the community who don't know the drug in your name, so you've been taking drugs, I know Victoria anyway, make a statement of non-complaint. And no point in your unsobriety, because it's never given consent.
No, thank you for bringing that up. There's also, so you can actually make a report. So what was?
It's called in Victoria. I'm not sure what it is in other states. It's called a statement of no complaint. So
okay, a statement of no complaint.
And then the police actually keep a record of those people without investigating them. But it means if the name keeps coming up, that they will start keeping a bit of an eye on it.
And that is really good to know, because some people aren't very comfortable with having something be investigated or, you know, looking at charges. So that is handy to know. There is also the Unregistered Practitioners Code of Conduct, which is pretty close, at least for the main important parts, to the actual clinician's code of conduct. And you can report facilitators, especially if they're making claims about being able to help you with your health, physical or mental health. They absolutely can and have been investigated by the health department. This came up with Cambo actually, and they did investigate Cambo facilitators, I believe, during the time that they rescheduled Cambo to S10. So even though it might not seem like it, there actually are places that you can report this to if something does go wrong. But it's also good to make sure that you at least talk to your friends. You know, like, keep each other safe. That's something that is really important and often doesn't happen enough. So that way we do kind of know who we can trust and who we can't. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of options out there, and I do encourage anyone who has actually experienced significant harm, like sexual assault or something like that, please do try to report that, because it is very important for the safety of everybody else as well as yourself. And I know it can be very hard and a lot of people don't report, but yeah, I'm just going to encourage anyone who does need to. Oh, we got a whole big group, yeah. Yeah, that is a really good question. Thank you. You want to start with that one, Simon?
Yeah, like there's heaps around. There's long-standing forums like Blue Light. There's Erowid. That's a great resource that has a lot of information about dosing, substances, and a lot of experience reports, and experience reports for combinations as well, where people describe in quite a lot of detail what taking that substance felt like, and that gives you some idea of what you're in for, which is a good part of preparation. There's harm reduction resources and light preparation resources on the EGA YouTube channel, on the Australian Psychedelic Society YouTube channel. We've got written resources as well, including mushroom identification resources, if that's what you're interested in. Beyond that, I know a lot of people turn to Reddit these days. I don't use it very much, so I don't know what the quality or reliability of that information is. No comment. And the community groups. So the Australian Psychedelic Society have chapters in a lot of the major cities, and also a good online presence. They're good places to actually ask other people for what their thoughts are around particular substances, particular settings, combinations, that sort of information, and just finding out how other people go about preparing for these experiences, because that's where the wealth of the knowledge is. So connect with that community and ask. There'll always be plenty of people that are happy to give you an answer, I think.
So yeah, we also have one of our talking circles each month. There is no topic, so you can come in and ask pretty much anything. Simon's often there, and he is actually a psychiatrist, and I'm also, I have a psychology degree, health science degree, and I'm into my Masters of Neuroscience. And then we also have a broad range of expertise that isn't always academic, but we've got a group of diverse backgrounds in there, and a lot of different people who know different things. Kane Barlow, definitely your bed for mushrooms. So yeah, that's definitely somewhere you could come and ask us. You could find us on Facebook as the Patch, the Psychedelically Aware Talking Circle Hub. And you can also ask questions just in the group as well. So just put up a post and ask about things, and plenty of people be happy to point you towards resources or talk about their own experiences. So while we do also have a group of us who are kind of running it, the whole point was to be like a community-led response, so formed by the community for the community. So there's just really a lot of other people in there. They're not necessarily like our committee or anything, but just lots of other psychedelic takers out there who will engage with you and you can have a conversation with. each people. So I guess APS does a lot of the like meetups in person, and yeah, we do heaps of stuff in the online space, and also then the other one each month. So they run every approximately 2 weeks is on a topic, and so then there's different things that you can learn about with each one, and they're always interesting and entertaining. You never quite know what's going to come up or which direction it's going to go in, especially too because like the community is very diverse, so we do have people in there with all kinds of backgrounds and I guess mental health stuff going on as well, and we're very welcoming for that, but definitely makes it an interesting time.
And as a disclaimer, I'll point out that I'm not a fully trained psychiatrist and that nothing I've said should be taken as personal medical advice.
No, yeah, I'm not saying we're personal medical advice or expertise either, but like we've at least spent a while learning about things, so we're hoping to be able to assist other people with that process. And definitely not responsible for anything that anybody does with the information provided. I don't know. Any other questions?
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Don't go away now. We're going to show you Kane's coming on with psilocybin. Yes, psilocybin. Psilocybin. Yes, that's the correct pronunciation apparently.
According to something.
Mushroom cultivation coming up, everyone. It's happening here. We're going to have a table and a demo. You can take photos. How do you want me to hold them up? The camera's on me now. Now it's like affecting me psychologically. So our next speaker is very exciting. Here he comes, and we're going to set up the table and have some demonstrations. Now, you do the table, bring it out. I'm going to work out your microphone right now. That's the big job. Awesome. Apparently you put it on your head.
You want to move the stage? Hi, man. Hi. You're not supposed to admit it.
Okay. Hello. I'm working. Yes. We are working. No feedback. I'm just testing here. Testing. Wherever I go, there's no feedback.
Very good.
Nothing. All right. Oh, I'm a bit noisy there, but I'll play with that. Return to sender. Alright, so we can just put that. Just like that. On the temple. Yes, so let's come around. Just find a comfortable spot. I'm doing it. Oh, I've got the power.